He never spoke. He just pointed. Every single morning. And no one ever asked, why? Edward Smith had everything this world says matters. Fortune. A name. A home so big it echoed when you breathed. But when his wife disappeared without a trace, something inside him shattered and never quite came back. The mansion grew quiet. Not peaceful, just silent. The kind of silence where grief hangs in the air like dust, and no one talks about it. Caroline's perfume still clung to the curtains. Her piano sat untouched in the sunroom. And every morning, their son Brian, a gentle boy with Down syndrome, walked alone to the hallway and pointed at a painting. He never said a word. He never had to. The staff looked away. His father stayed buried in meetings, pretending the pointing meant nothing. But that boy was trying to speak, not with his mouth, but with the part of the soul that aches for someone to listen. Then Jane came. She didn't have much. Not status, not degrees, just a worn suitcase, a quiet strength, and a heart that still believed God could speak through the small things. She noticed the boy. She felt the weight in the walls, and something in her spirit told her, this isn't just grief, something's being hidden. So she started watching, not with suspicion, but with love. And one day, when Brian pointed again, Jane didn't walk past like everyone else. She walked toward him, and that was the day everything began to break open. Before we begin this journey, take a moment. Breathe. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever carried silence so heavy it hurt to hold in your chest, if you've ever prayed for a sign and felt like heaven was quiet, then this story is for you. Click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope what you're about to hear reminds you of one simple truth. God still sees, even when no one else does. And sometimes He sends the right person, at the right time, to open the frame we've all been too afraid to touch. There was a kind of stillness inside the Smith estate, not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of something abandoned, like a church long emptied, where the prayers had stopped, but the echoes still lingered in the corners. Edward walked through the halls with the same tired rhythm each day, black coffee in his hand, eyes on his phone, heart nowhere to be found. He was a man once known for innovation, a billionaire tech visionary, they said, but these days even his reflection looked like someone else's. Grief has a way of making time stand still, and in this house it had done just that. 6 years had passed since Caroline vanished, but her presence clung to the rooms like a scent the air refused to let go. Her piano still sat beneath the window, untouched. A thin coat of dust had made it look like it belonged to someone who died long ago. But Caroline hadn't died, at least not officially. She had disappeared, vanished without explanation, without goodbye, leaving behind only questions and a son too young to understand what the word gone really meant. Brian was 8 now. He spent most of his time in his own quiet world, drawing, watching, listening. He was gentle, innocent, the kind of soul who made you believe God still made things unspoiled. But even innocence feels the weight of absence. And every morning, after breakfast, Brian would leave the kitchen, walk down the east hallway, and stop in front of a single painting, a portrait of 2 Victorian women standing in a garden. He would stand still, raise his hand, point to the same corner of the golden frame, and just stare. No one asked why. Not the cooks, not the butler, not even Edward. They had grown used to it. It was just something Brian did. A quirk, a habit, a silent ritual. And maybe that's what grief does. It numbs you until holy things seem ordinary, and the cries of a child become background noise. But Jane Ellison wasn't numb. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying a plain suitcase and wearing shoes that had seen too many floors. She didn't come from wealth. She came from need. But more than that, she came with a softness the house hadn't known in years. She greeted the staff kindly, tucked her clothes into a drawer quietly, and learned the rhythms of the house without asking too many questions. But what she noticed, from the very first day, was the boy. She saw him in the hallway, finger raised to that old frame, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask, but she felt something that made her heart pull in a way she hadn't felt since the day she'd prayed for a reason to stay alive. It was like God was nudging her, whispering, "Don't look away from this one." She began timing her work to pass through the hallway each morning, dusting, folding, sweeping, but always slowing when Brian was there. He never looked at her, but he never hid either. He just pointed, quietly, faithfully, like a watchman with no words, waiting for someone to finally see. That week, Jane learned not to speak too loudly in the mornings. She learned that the library door creaked, and that Caroline's perfume still sat untouched on the dresser in the master bedroom. She learned that Edward never came home before dark, and even when he did, his footsteps were fast, his eyes distracted, his soul nowhere in sight. But most of all, she learned how heavy silence could feel when no one had the courage to ask what was underneath it. Then, one afternoon, as golden light spilled through the hallway windows, Jane passed the painting again. Brian was standing there, finger raised, eyes wide, still, and this time, she stopped. She stood beside him, said nothing, watched with him, and when he lowered his hand and looked up at her, just for a moment, she felt it in her chest. This boy wasn't pointing at a painting. He was pointing at pain, at truth, at something someone had hidden, hoping it would never be found. She whispered a small prayer under her breath. "God, if there's something you want me to see, show me." And in that quiet hallway, beneath that golden frame, something stirred. Not in the wall, but in her. Something had begun, and it would not be silenced. Jane didn't say a word about that moment in the hallway. She didn't tell the housekeeper. She didn't tell Edward. She didn't even tell herself what she felt. But something had changed. The next morning, she adjusted her schedule, shifted her cleaning route so she'd pass by the hallway at the same time, not out of suspicion, not even out of duty, but because the silence had started speaking, and she'd heard it. Brian was there again, right on time. He stood close to the frame, his little hand raised like before, his eyes focused, still, faithful. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sound, no tears, just stillness. But Jane could feel it, the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from a child who had learned how to carry truth without help. He didn't look at her. Not yet. But he didn't move away either. That was something. In the kitchen, the staff moved like clockwork. They spoke in short sentences, laughed politely, and kept their questions to themselves. Jane was careful not to overstep, but one afternoon, while drying her hands, she asked one of the older maids, "Has he always pointed at that painting?" The woman paused, just for a second too long. Then she gave a half-smile and said, "He's done it for years. We don't think much of it. Poor child." Jane didn't press. But she noticed the way the woman didn't meet her eyes. She noticed how, later that day, the staff moved a little more quickly around her. Not cold, just careful, as if silence wasn't just a habit here. It was the house rule. That night, Jane sat alone in her room with a single lamp on. She opened her Bible, not out of ritual, but because her hands needed something steady to hold. Her eyes landed on a verse she hadn't planned to read. "Nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light." Luke 8:17. She closed the book gently. Something in her heart whispered, "Don't look away." The next morning, it was raining. Soft, steady, like the sky was washing something clean. Jane passed through the east hallway again. And, as always, Brian stood in front of the painting. But this time, he turned his head, just slightly, and looked at her. His eyes were gentle, wounded, but open, and she nodded. A quiet nod, like a promise. She slowed her steps and let herself stand beside him again. Just for a moment, he raised his hand to the corner of the frame. Same spot. Same stillness. Jane leaned in, ever so slightly, and there, along the edge of the golden gilding, she saw it. A small crack. Just a sliver, almost hidden in the ornate pattern. Easy to miss if you weren't looking, but unmistakable if you were. She didn't touch it. Not yet. She just stared, then looked down at Brian. He was still pointing. She whispered gently, "Is this where it hurts?" He didn't speak, but something in his eyes shifted, like he knew she'd finally seen it. That evening, Jane lingered longer in the hallway after her duties. She didn't touch the frame. She didn't try to solve anything. She just stood in the quiet, listening with her spirit. She could feel the weight of something waiting, not like a ghost, not like fear, more like the way a truth waits for someone brave enough to uncover it. As she turned to walk away, she heard footsteps. Sharp, fast, unmistakable. Edward. He hadn't been home this early in weeks. He paused when he saw her standing still in the hallway, facing the painting. Their eyes met, and for a split second, the air between them changed. He looked at the painting, then at her. "What are you doing?" he asked. Not with anger, but with confusion, like he'd caught someone speaking a language he hadn't heard in years. Jane stepped back, hands folded. "Just dusting, sir," she said softly. Edward's eyes lingered on the frame, then on her again. There was something in his expression, a flicker of discomfort, a memory maybe, or guilt too old to name. He nodded once and turned away. Didn't ask anything else. Didn't wait for a reply. Just disappeared down the hall like a man who'd seen a door he wasn't ready to open. Jane stood there a moment longer, alone again, but not afraid, because now she knew. Whatever Brian had been pointing to all these years, it was real, and it was waiting. The air felt heavier that morning. It wasn't the weather, or the staff, or even the silence, though that still wrapped the house like fog. It was something else. Something inside Jane. She had seen the crack. She had felt the weight in Brian's stillness. She had looked into Edward's eyes and seen something fractured. And now she couldn't unsee it. She moved through her chores slowly that day. Her hands cleaned surfaces. Her feet stepped lightly through the halls. But her mind stayed with the painting. Every room she entered felt hollow. The corners of the house seemed to whisper, not loudly, not angrily, just waiting. Brian had been unusually quiet too, even for him. At breakfast, he didn't touch his food, didn't draw, didn't hum to himself like he sometimes did. He just stared at the hallway, like his soul was holding its breath. When the house settled into its mid-morning rhythm, Jane found herself alone. The staff were downstairs. Edward was gone again. The world outside the window was still, and the frame was right where it always had been. She stood before it, one hand resting gently on the wall. Brian wasn't with her this time, but she felt him there anyway. She whispered without thinking, "Lord, if I'm wrong, stop me." And with that, she reached up. Her fingers found the side of the frame, cool, smooth, familiar. Then slowly, she lifted it from the wall. It moved easier than she expected. No lock, no resistance. Just dust and time and something unseen holding it in place. Behind it was a hole, a small, jagged opening in the wall, hidden behind cobwebs and decades of quiet. Jane's breath caught. Inside was a velvet pouch, aged and dark with time. She reached in carefully, heart pounding, fingers trembling as they closed around the fabric. She pulled it out. It was heavier than she expected. Inside were folded letters, old photographs, and a small plastic bag, wrapped tightly around a flash drive. She didn't speak, didn't gasp, didn't cry. She just stood there, heart thudding in her chest, as the house held still. Then she heard it, soft. Behind her, a small voice. One word, "Mom." Jane turned. Brian stood at the edge of the hallway, his eyes wide and wet, his voice barely more than breath. He stepped forward once, his gaze fixed on the pouch in her hands. He said it again. Mom said, "It's here." The words weren't perfect. His voice shook, but he had spoken. A full sentence. For the first time in months, Jane's knees went weak. Not from fear, but from the holy weight of it. This wasn't a discovery. It was a cry finally heard. She knelt to Brian's level, eyes locked on his. "You've been trying to tell us, haven't you?" He nodded once, then stepped closer, gently placed his hand on the pouch, like it was sacred, like he had always known it was there. Later, in her room, Jane opened the pouch alone. She laid everything out carefully on the bed. The letters were written in a woman's hand, Caroline's. The photographs showed a younger Edward, Caroline smiling beside him, Brian as a toddler in her arms. One picture showed Caroline standing beside a building with the Smith family logo behind her, but the look in her eyes was different. Focused, worried, like she knew something no one else did. Jane reached for the flash drive. She stared at it a long time, then folded everything back up and tucked it deep into her drawer. Not out of fear, out of reverence, because this wasn't just evidence. It was the voice of a woman who'd been silenced, and a child who had carried that silence for 6 years. That evening, Jane passed Brian in the hallway again. He didn't point. He didn't speak. He just looked up at her, not with fear or confusion, but with something stronger. Trust. She didn't say anything, just smiled. And in that moment, Jane knew the story wasn't finished. It was only just beginning. The flash drive sat on Jane's nightstand like a question she wasn't ready to answer. She had stared at it for 3 nights. Not out of fear. Not really. But because some truths don't just reveal what happened. They reveal who people really are. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. Downstairs, the house moved as always. The cook prepared meals no one fully enjoyed. The staff kept to their duties, nodding but never lingering. And Edward came and went with the weight of a man who hadn't looked someone in the eyes in a very long time. He had said nothing since the moment he saw Jane near the painting. Not a question. Not a word. But something in him had shifted. He passed her in the halls more slowly now. Like he wanted to speak, but didn't know how to start. And Brian. Brian had started watching her differently. Not with his eyes he'd always watched, but with something deeper. Trust had taken root. He didn't speak again. Not yet. But he no longer pointed at the painting. He just stood near it, waiting, like he knew Jane had taken the weight from him, and now it was her turn to carry it. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Jane sat on her bed with the flash drive in her hand. The storm outside had settled. A breeze moved the curtain near the window. She plugged the drive into her old laptop, the screen flickering to life with a quiet hum. It took a moment. Then folders appeared. No names. Just codes. She clicked the first one. Inside were scanned documents, emails, medical files, legal drafts. Some had Edward's name on them. Others were marked with a company logo she didn't recognize. Most were dated 6 years ago. Her heart began to pound. She clicked on a file labeled simply, "For Edward." A video opened, and there she was, Caroline, sitting in a dimly lit room, hair pulled back, eyes tired but steady. She looked directly into the camera. "If you're seeing this," she began, voice low, steady, "then I've probably disappeared, and I want you to know this wasn't some accident." Jane leaned closer, heart aching. "Edward, I begged you to listen. I begged you to look into it. The trials are not clean. The data's being buried. People are getting sick. Some are dying, and your board is hiding it." Caroline paused, eyes blinking back something fear, maybe, or certainty. "I'm not unstable. I'm not emotional. I'm trying to protect people. But they know I have the files, and if they find me before this gets out..." Her voice caught. "If something happens to me, please, don't let it stay buried. The truth is closer than you think." The screen froze as the video ended. Jane sat back, hands cold, eyes burning. This wasn't just a warning. It was a goodbye. And maybe a plea. She closed the laptop gently. The weight of what she'd seen settled over her chest like a stone. This wasn't just about corruption. It wasn't just about missing files or ethical breaches. This was a woman trying to speak through time, through silence, through fear. And she had spoken to Jane. Not because Jane was the smartest. Not because she had power, but maybe because she was the only one who had stopped long enough to listen. The next morning, Jane moved through the house with careful steps. She wasn't sure what to say, or who to trust. She passed Edward in the hallway. He didn't look at her, but he paused, just briefly, and then kept walking, like a man trying to outrun something he used to believe. Later that day, she found Brian near the window, sitting cross-legged with crayons spread across the floor. He had drawn something new. A woman with long brown hair, standing near a window. Beside her, a child, both figures smiling. Jane knelt down. "Is that your mom?" she asked. Brian nodded. Then he looked up at Jane, holding her gaze. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Because sometimes, the deepest things don't live in words. They live in the spaces between us, in drawings, in silence, in the hands of someone who finally stays. That night, Jane sat with her Bible again. Her thumb traced a verse she didn't remember marking. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1-5. She closed her eyes. The light was beginning to shine, but the darkness was not done yet. Jane waited until the hallway was still, not empty. Still, she knew it had to be that kind of quiet. Not just outside the body, but inside the soul. Edward had been home all day, though no one had seen much of him. His study door had remained shut. His coffee sat untouched on the side table. Something had shifted since she entered that hallway with the frame, and she knew. It was time. She walked slowly toward the study, flash drive in her pocket, Caroline's face still etched in her mind. She knocked once. The pause before his voice came was longer than she expected. "Come in." She stepped inside. The room was large but dim, the blinds mostly drawn. Stacks of folders lined the edge of the desk. A photograph of Brian as a baby sat near a pile of unopened mail. Edward looked up, tired, guarded. "Jane," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Is something wrong?" She stepped forward. Her hands were steady, but her voice soft, clear, carried the weight of everything she had seen. "There's something I need to show you," she said. "I believe Caroline left it behind, for you." Edward leaned back in his chair. His expression didn't change, but the room seemed to shift. "What do you mean?" he asked. She didn't answer with words. Not at first. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket, walked to his desk, and placed it down gently, as if she were placing a folded letter on a grave. Edward stared at it, then back at her. "What is this?" His voice was quieter now, tighter. "Evidence," she said. "Files, letters, a video, from Caroline. She hid them behind the painting." He didn't move. She waited. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but thick, like a rope being pulled from opposite ends. After a moment, he stood, walked slowly around the desk, picked up the drive, turned it over in his fingers like it might vanish. Then his eyes met hers. "She recorded a video?" he asked. Jane nodded. "It's addressed to you." Edward looked away. For a long time, he said nothing, just stared at the drive in his hand. Then, he whispered something almost too low to hear. "She was trying to tell me." Jane didn't speak, didn't move. "She came to me once," he said, still not looking at her. "Said something was wrong with the trial data. Accused the board, I thought." He shook his head. "I told her she was being paranoid, that she needed rest." A pause. A breath. "She cried," he added. "I remember that." Jane felt her throat tighten. She stepped closer. "She wasn't paranoid," she said gently. She was protecting people. Edward sat down again, the drive still in his hand. His eyes looked older now, not just tired, but cracked. "Why didn't she just leave?" he asked, voice barely audible. "She could have taken Brian, gone somewhere safe." "She was trying to stay close to the truth," Jane said. "She thought maybe if you saw it with your own eyes, you'd fight for it." Edward leaned back, closed his eyes. And, for the first time in years, Jane saw a man who wasn't holding up an empire. Just a man who had let someone down. Someone he loved. Someone he hadn't believed. Down the hall, a soft sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Small ones. Brian appeared at the doorway, still in his socks, holding a crayon in one hand. He looked from Edward to Jane, then at the flash drive in his father's hand. He walked forward, not fast, not afraid. He stopped beside the desk, rested his hand gently on the edge, and whispered, "She said you'd listen." Edward looked at his son. The boy wasn't crying, wasn't begging, just standing there, hope woven into his quiet presence. And something in Edward broke. He covered his mouth with one hand, and for the first time in a long, long while, he wept. Not loudly, not for show, but the kind of tears that come when the truth finally speaks louder than pride. Jane stepped back. Let them have the room. As she closed the door behind her, she whispered under her breath, "Thank you, Lord. He's listening now." The air inside the mansion felt different the next morning, like something had shifted. Not in the furniture, not in the routines, but in the space between the walls, in the silence that had always filled them. It was no longer hollow. It was holding something. Edward didn't come down for breakfast. He stayed behind the door of his study, alone with the drive, alone with Caroline's voice still echoing from the night before. Jane didn't disturb him. She let the weight of the truth do its work. Brian sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of him. He hadn't touched his crayons yet. He just stared at the paper, quiet, focused. Jane poured him juice and sat across from him. He didn't look up. He was drawing something slowly, carefully, not like a child playing, but like someone remembering. When he finally pushed the paper toward her, Jane leaned in. It wasn't like the others. No people, no house, no sun, just shapes. Dark, overlapping shapes, like shadows. Thick lines in corners, doorways, windows. It took her a moment before she realized he was drawing the house, room by room, and in every corner, every hallway, he'd drawn a figure small, shaded, watching. She looked at him, her throat tight. "Brian, what is this?" He looked at her eyes, clear, steady, and he said, quietly, "Bad people." 2 words. That's all, but they hit harder than anything she'd ever heard. Later that afternoon, Edward emerged. His eyes were red. Not puffy, not theatrical, just used. Used to holding things in, used to being wrong, used to being too late. Jane was in the hallway when he passed. She didn't say anything, but he stopped, held out the flash drive, his hand slightly shaking. "She was right," he said. Not like a confession, more like a surrender. Jane met his eyes, and in them, for the first time, she saw the man Caroline must have believed in. She didn't stop because she was stubborn, Jane said softly. She stopped because no one listened. Edward looked away, then whispered, almost to himself, "I don't know how to fix what I let break." Behind them, a soft sound echoed down the hallway. Small footsteps. Brian appeared again, holding the same drawing. He didn't say anything, just held it up for his father. Edward knelt, took the paper in his hands. He looked at the shadows, the shapes, the eyes drawn in the corners. What is this?" he asked. Jane stepped closer. "It's what he saw," she said. "Back then, when Caroline vanished, after, all of it." Edward looked up at her, then at Brian, then back at the drawing, suddenly seeing not crayon lines, but memory. Not imagination, but testimony. He remembered. Edward whispered. He always remembered, Jane said. You just never asked. Edward looked at Brian, really looked at him. His eyes filled. Not with confusion this time, but grief. Not the kind that blames death. The kind that blames silence. He placed his hand on Brian's shoulder, gently, tender, unsteady. I'm sorry, he said, voice cracking, guard down, for not seeing you. Brian didn't say anything, but he leaned forward, placed his forehead against his father's, and for a moment, a long, aching moment, the mansion held its breath. That night, Edward walked the halls alone. He paused in front of the frame, touched the wall where the painting once hung, then kept walking, like a man finally ready to face what lived beyond the surface. In her room, Jane watched the storm roll in through the window. She thought of Caroline, of the shadows, of the child who had carried the truth like a cross on his back. She whispered a prayer, not for answers, just for courage, because the truth had broken something. But maybe that's how the healing begins. The house was quiet again, but not in the same way. This silence felt different, not empty, not cold. It was the kind of silence that comes after something breaks open, when no one knows how to speak yet, but everyone knows something holy just happened. Edward hadn't said much since that moment with Brian. Not during dinner, not afterward. He just sat across from his son, watching him eat, as if trying to memorize every expression he'd ignored for far too long. That night, the rain returned. Steady, gentle. Jane stood at the window of her room, arms folded. Below, she could see Edward pacing the gravel path that curved through the garden. He walked like a man chasing the past, as if every step might bring her back. Caroline. Her name lived in every corner of this house, even if no one had said it aloud for years. And now, she didn't feel like a memory anymore. She felt close, as if she were just behind some veil, watching, waiting. The next morning, Edward knocked on Jane's door. Not loud, just once. She opened it, surprised. He stood there, eyes heavy but clear. I need your help, he said. Jane stepped aside. He came in, holding a file folder filled with printed copies of the documents from the flash drive. He'd stayed up all night, sorting them, organizing, reading, reliving. I didn't want to believe it, he said, sitting on the edge of the chair. I saw her notes years ago. I told myself she was overreacting, tired, emotional. Jane didn't speak. She let the weight settle. She was right, he whispered. Then, quietly, almost like it hurt to say, she was trying to save lives, and I was trying to protect my company. He looked at Jane. I chose the wrong thing. She met his gaze. Then choose the right thing now. They spent the day going through every file, every email, every report, every letter she had hidden. Caroline had left a trail, not a desperate one, a methodical one. There were references to internal files, encrypted codes, safe deposit boxes, a meeting she never made it to, an address in Vermont. Edward sat back in his chair. Some of these locations, he said, pointing to one address. This is one of the towns where we used to run product testing. Jane leaned in. Is it still active? No, Edward said. It was shut down after she disappeared, quietly, no announcement. He paused. But this, he tapped the address again, this could be where she went, or where she tried to hide the rest. Jane looked at him carefully. What if she didn't run? He glanced up. What if she was forced to disappear? She continued. What if someone tried to silence her, and she found a way to survive? Edward's face tightened. A long silence passed. Then he said, I have people, private investigators. I trust them. I'll send them the documents. Jane hesitated. Will they protect her, if they find her? Edward met her eyes. For the first time, there was no corporate polish in his face. No armor. I will, he said. That night, Jane tucked Brian into bed. He looked up at her as she pulled the covers over him, his hand wrapped around one of his drawings. He pointed to the corner of the paper. A small figure. A woman standing beneath a tree, holding something or someone close. He whispered, "She's not gone." Jane's eyes burned. "No, sweetheart," she said, brushing his hair back. "She's not." 3 days passed. Edward waited by the phone. Every ring made him flinch. Every silence made him ache. He didn't sleep much. He started walking the halls at night, not out of restlessness, but like a man trying to remember the house his wife once loved. He paused by the piano, ran a hand along the dusty keys, closed his eyes, and for the first time, he spoke her name aloud. Caroline. A whisper. A prayer. A wish he no longer knew how to hold. The next morning, the call came. Jane heard the phone ring, heard Edward pick it up. Then, nothing. No words. Just silence on the other side of the door. When he finally stepped into the hallway, his eyes were wet, his hands shaking. "She's alive," he said. His voice broke. "She's alive." When Caroline walked through the doors of the mansion again, she didn't speak right away. She stood in the entryway, wrapped in a worn grey coat, as if the years had settled into her shoulders like snow. Edward stood across from her, eyes searching a face he'd tried to forget and never stopped loving. She looked thinner, older, but her presence filled the space like light breaking into a sealed room. And when Brian appeared at the top of the stairs, she lifted her hand, slow, trembling. He stared for a long moment. Then, wordlessly, he walked down the steps, his small feet echoing on the marble. He crossed the floor and stopped just in front of her. Caroline knelt. Tears streaked down her face as she reached out. But she didn't say, "Come here." She didn't beg. She waited. And Brian, without hesitation, placed his hand on her cheek. Soft, steady. "You came back," he whispered. And then he folded into her arms like he had never stopped believing she would. They stayed that way for a long time. No rush, no camera flash, no witnesses, but the walls that had waited with them. Jane stood quietly in the background. She didn't need to be seen. She just needed this to happen. And it did. Not as a miracle, but as something more rare. A promise kept. Later that day, the house felt different. The kitchen filled with warmth again. Staff moved with a softness that hadn't been there in years. Windows were opened. The mansion finally breathed. Caroline sat in the garden with Jane while Brian played nearby, his laughter soft but certain. "I didn't know if I'd ever see this place again," Caroline said. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. Jane nodded. "I think part of you never left." Caroline smiled faintly. "I left so much behind. I didn't know if anyone would carry it." "You left it with the right person," Jane said. Caroline turned to her. "Thank you." It wasn't casual. It came from the place where hope once lay buried. The place Jane had quietly uncovered, piece by piece. In the days that followed, the storm finally turned outward. Edward made a statement to the press, raw, unpolished, real. He turned over the documents, testified against members of his own board, refused to protect what had nearly cost him his wife and nearly destroyed his son. Headlines exploded. Executives were suspended. Lawsuits began. Whispers of criminal charges turned louder by the hour. Edward didn't run. He stood beside Caroline at every meeting, every call, shoulders squared, eyes open. "I'm not the victim here," he told reporters. "My wife was, my son was. I just stopped listening." Jane remained in the background, the one who had first moved the painting, the one who had stayed when others looked away. She didn't want credit, didn't want spotlight. She just wanted Brian to sleep without nightmares. And he did. One afternoon, Caroline walked through the east hallway alone. The frame was gone now. The wall had been patched. In its place, a new photograph. Not posed, just a moment caught in time. Jane, Brian, Edward, and Caroline, standing together in the garden, Brian's hand on Jane's. Edward, looking at his son, not past him. The kind of image you wouldn't expect in a house like this. but exactly the kind that belonged. Caroline stared at it. She touched the frame gently, not to move it, just to remember. Then she whispered, "I think we're going to be all right." But not everything was easy. Some days, the media trucks still parked outside the gates. Some nights, Edward still sat alone with his guilt. Brian still drew shadows sometimes, not out of fear, but as a way of remembering what he'd survived. And Jane? She stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this wasn't just a job anymore. It was family. The battle wasn't over, but the silence was. And in its place came something close to peace. The mansion didn't look different from the outside. Its stone walls were the same. Its windows caught the same morning light. The garden still bloomed in silence. But inside, everything had changed. It had been 5 months since the truth came out, since Caroline walked back through the front door, since Edward stood up and stopped running. There were still interviews, still court dates, legal reviews, unanswered questions. But somehow, it didn't define them anymore, because something deeper had taken root. A family, not perfect, not polished, but real. Brian didn't point at the wall anymore. He didn't need to. The frame he once stood beneath, the one he touched in silence for 6 straight years, was gone. In its place was a new one. Simple, wooden, handcrafted. Inside it, a photograph. The 4 of them, standing in the back garden. Caroline kneeling beside Brian, her arm around his shoulders. Jane, standing just behind them. Edward beside her, his hand resting lightly on Brian's back. No one in the photo was posing. They weren't smiling for the world. They were smiling for each other. That morning, Jane passed the hallway as she always did. Her steps slower now. Not because she was tired, because she wanted to remember. She paused at the new frame. Not to straighten it, just to look. Behind her, Brian appeared. No words, just presence. He reached out, not to point, but to hold her hand. She looked down. "Do you like it?" she asked. He nodded, a soft, knowing smile on his face. Then he whispered, "She doesn't need to hide anymore." In the kitchen, Caroline stirred honey into her tea. Edward was at the table, sketching a redesign for a foundation they had started together. A program for whistleblower protection, named in honor of those who had risked their voices and those who were never heard. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" Edward asked, not looking up. Caroline thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said. "We're not meant to go back. We're meant to carry forward." He nodded. Silence passed between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was full of grace. That evening, the 4 of them sat on the garden bench, just past the tree line. Jane had made lemonade. Brian leaned against her shoulder, drawing shapes in a small sketchbook. This time, they weren't shadows. They were people. One had long hair like Caroline. One had short hair like Edward. One had an apron and a soft smile. And in the middle, a boy with a yellow sun over his head. Brian showed it to them. Caroline gasped softly. Edward smiled, eyes wet. Jane wrapped her arm around him and said, "That's the one I'll hang on the fridge." Brian laughed. A real laugh. And it echoed across the lawn like something that had waited years to be born. Later that night, Jane stood in the hallway one last time. She looked at the new frame. It didn't carry secrets. It carried memory. It carried healing. It carried the image of what silence had almost stolen, and what love had slowly, painfully, beautifully restored. She placed her palm against the wall, not for answers, for gratitude, then turned, smiling as she walked away. The boy doesn't point anymore. He doesn't need to, because someone finally listened. And once the truth was seen, there was no going back. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with people choosing to stay, choosing to listen, choosing to love again, even when it hurts. The frame is still there. But now, it holds a picture, a family, and that's the only truth left to tell.